Hi, I'm Rachel. You might see Missy jumping around behind you a bit, perhaps. And I am here to continue with a January booktube project I'm doing where I look back on the last decade of my reading. I'm using the GoodReads sheets that they give us at the end of each year with all of the pretty icons attached. And last week I did a video on the longest and shortest books I read throughout the teens or tens, and this week I'm jumping a little down the page into the most read and least read books according to my Goodreads stats. This will be an interesting list, I think, because some of my least read books are like really not that read, including one that says it has 0 people who have read it, which is a bit baffling to me because the whole reason it's on my spreadsheet or stat sheet is because I've read it. Anyway, I have 20 books to talk about, so I'm going to try to make things snappy now, and I will insert pictures of the books right up here. Starting in 2010, the most read book I read was The Lovely Bones, with about 2 million people. I remember I was quite into it at the time, the way that it used sort of supernatural elements to explore trauma, particularly of the rape and murder variety, and that it was based off of the author's experience of being raped herself, sort of dealing with that sense of trauma. And I know I also read it shortly before the Saoirse Ronan movie came out, which I really liked as well. I think it's less intense in my memory now, but it was I really was into it at the time. And my least read book was a collection of short stories, The Best New American Voices. I read with 80 people. And that was put out by MFA programs for fiction writers. I remember I was reading it, I think, when I was visiting my family in Kansas, like reading it in the... Sorry, the cat! Reading it in my aunt's attic. And now all I think I remember off the top of my head is a story about a mother and a daughter who travel abroad somewhere. In 2011, the book I read with the most reads was Game of Thrones, with almost 2 million people. I think this was the number at that time. I have a feeling that that number didn't update, even though it's from 2011, at least in the stats I'm showing up above. I could easily go to the Game of Thrones page and see how many people have read the first book of the series since 2011, which I assume is a lot, because 2011 was the very beginning of the TV show, and then the TV show took off like a shot. And a lot more people are reading it now. This is another book I was very obsessed with at the time. I read it right before the TV show started, in fact, and still has a special place in my heart. I think did a lot of things right, both the show and the books. And then my least read book was Our Haggadah, Uniting Traditions. I read it with 80 other people. This was by Cokie Roberts and her husband, so I guess it didn't make as much of a splash as the rest of her work as a writer. But, you know, she's writing about interfaith families, so that's why I grabbed it, and I even wrote a review of the book. I talked about this very same book in my last video of the decade, but I'll just link right back down to the blog post I wrote about the Haggadah. In 2012, the book I read with the most other reads was The Hunger Games, with almost 6 million other people. This is the most hyped book on my list, with the most amount of other people who read it, which I guess is understandable because I think, like a lot of social media, it's dominated by YA. And I gotta say, I'm with the hype on this one. This was a series that, if anything, means more to me now than it even did when I was reading it, and I've reread it and written a lot of think pieces about it, and I just really appreciate the way that Collins wrote about war and trauma and propaganda and all sorts of things. And like a whole lot of other people, I'm waiting with bated breath for the new book. It's going to be rather intense, I'm sure, when it comes out, because everybody and their grandma's going to have an opinion. But I'm expecting good things. And I will surely report back on what I think. Probably more than once. Then the least read book I read that year was called New Lines from the Old State, which I read with 2 other people, at least on GoodReads. I think in the broader world, with all of these probably, there are more people who read them. New Lines from the Old State was a anthology of short stories that was put out by the Maryland Writers Association, which I heard about actually through my biology teacher from high school. She was a member. I think she had a short story published in this anthology even. It took me several more years to actually join MWA, and it's a pretty happening organization. You know, a lot of Maryland counties have active chapters, and we have a hopping annual conference that's coming up, stuff like that, anthologies that are coming up, and a literary journal that comes out a couple times a year. So, yeah, I mean, what I remember about this too was that I could only find it easily in my university's special collections. So I sat in the reading room for a day and I read it because I couldn't take it out. You know, you can't take things out of, check things out of special collections, but I still wanted to read it. And then I'm glad I did. In 2013, the most read book I read was Life of Pi with a little over 1 million people. Another book I remember reading, I think I read this to watch the movie, and I was supposed to meet up with some friends, and we were going to do like this book-to-screen club where we'd read the movie and then watch the adaptation, and it just kind of didn't work out. It's another one I kind of remember for being sensational in terms of what really happened on the boat and what it says about surviving life and death or near-death experiences. That I think was a little controversial, although I'm just not as in tune with it anymore exactly what went down. And then, speaking of Game of Thrones, the least read book was Beyond the Wall, which is a bunch of essays, I think just about the books, not about the TV show. So about 2,000 other people or 2,500 other people read this along with me. I guess I didn't read a lot of very unpopular books that year. Certainly most fans aren't interested in literary criticism of the books such as it is, but you know, the fandom is large enough that 2,500 other people were interested. I also don't remember much about this collection, but I could just pick it up again because there haven't been any other books published since then, gotta say. In 2014, which might have coincided with the beginning of some of my booktubing, because I think I remember talking about The Fault in Our Stars as a favorite book of the year at the end of the year. It was my 3rd favorite read. Almost about 3 million people also read it. And I still really feel fondly about that book. I feel like it was such a heart-rending and genuine take on what it means to be living with something that'll kill you, basically, and how to go about having relationships and your relationships with more, you know, metaphysically with life and death. I found it very moving. And then my least read book with 0 people was Minerva Rising Literary Journal, which I put on my GoodReads list that year because my first short story as an adult was published in this anthology. And I swear I wasn't the person to make an entry for this particular volume of the literary journal. I found it, like randomly through searching or something, but I guess the other person didn't do anything else other than make the entry. I don't know. But totally unbiased opinion here, you should buy and read this collection. In 2015, I think this is a theme with John Green novels, but the most read novel I read was Paper Towns with a little over 1 million people. I was a lot less impressed with this novel. I feel like in his way of trying to debunk the idea of a manic pixie dream girl, he created one. And the plot was a little too out there for me, following these quirky characters around. So I was a little disappointed, but it doesn't take away from The Fault in Our Stars for me. And then the least read book I read that year was American Children, which apparently only one other person read. I think I talked about this in my last video too. I found it at my job. It came across my desk. It's a 1980s Jewish American novel, and it should just stay back there. Not worth your time. In 2016, the most read book that I read was The Shining, again with about 1 million other people. I listened to it on audio, in fact, and the main reason I did this is because I figured I should at least read one Stephen King book in my life. And of course, I think The Shining is his most successful movie, maybe. I mean, he has obviously a lot of adaptations out there, but I know the 80s film kind of lives on in infamy. Although, much like King himself, I believe, I'm a bigger fan of the sci-fi miniseries from, I think it was the late 90s, which I focused a lot more on Jack Torrance's alcoholism and less on the, kookiness stuff. Anyway, my memories of the audiobook are, it's serviceable writing, I guess a compelling story in the telling, although I think it wasn't as spooky as I thought it would be, but then again, I think it's, I knew the story pretty well by then, so, And then the least read collection that I read, again, is short stories I read with 15 other people called Zigzag Wanderer. It was a holiday gift from my mother, who finds quirky gifts for me all the time. And this one was, I think, by a local writer who, instead of taking money for himself, encouraged donations to charity. So not exactly sure how she picked it up. And I have to admit, I remember very little about the collection, although I ultimately decided to unhaul it. Although I also have personal existential issues with how difficult it is to remember most short stories. In 2017, the most read book I read was The Night Circus with almost 700,000 people, I guess. I remember The Night Circus was pretty polarizing in terms of people really liking or really disliking it. And I'm more on the side of dislike. I feel like it's way too much style over substance for me. And as much as maybe I'd like to go to the circus and look around one day, I did not find the character beats to be all that compelling. And I remember I just recently listened to a Book Olive's review of the second book that Morgenstern just put out this year, and she was somebody who was in love with the Night Circus, and she was very disappointed with this book, so I'm going to stay away from the Starless Sea, I think. And then the least read book of the year I also talked about in my last decade video was Legends of the Californios, which 7 other people read, and I kind of have to assume that the author, encouraged people to add it or something, because it's a very localized story. I picked it up in a bookstore in San Diego, and it's about a Hispanic community in San Diego, in the California area, really. A historical novel of sorts, although self-published and not really all that good in terms of the writing, but I was glad to give something a shot that I wouldn't find most places. In 2018, the book I read with the most other reads was Fahrenheit 451, with a little over 1,500,000 people. I guess the numbers are getting pretty big. Once again, a controversial opinion, but I really dislike Fahrenheit 451, and it's weird because I appreciate the message. I mean, I appreciate the whole idea of that we should look at censorship and also self-censorship in terms of preferring not to be challenged in any way, and maybe even being a little too sensitive when it comes to reading offensive books, which, I'm all a fan of calling out books for being offensive, but it's good to at least read and understand them. I mean, I think it's more about that than a critique of totalitarian government, even. And I'm cool with that, but what I really dislike about the book is that it's a short story that's been stretched out way too long, and it's just, awful and didactic and, patronizing, and I just think, you're already taking, moralizing theme, and then you're, beating us over the heads with it, and it just doesn't work. And the least read book I read this year was Station Identification, which I'm excited to talk about. 5 other people read it because it is a nonfiction book. Talking about me trying to get into reading some more nonfiction up in here. This one was part of my Sammy Rohr Prize reading project, where I read books for a prize that honors emerging Jewish writers. And this one was particularly about Jewish history through the lens of radio shows. And it's quite fascinating to think of in the early days, like, people using the radio to learn English, like all immigrant communities did that, 100 years ago. Or how Yiddish theater stars would slum it, with their radio shows. And the radio was, really was a lot more like pop culture TV of today than you might think. Like, where the celebrity radio stars would go and give live performances that people would flock to. So I feel like it's not that different from pop culture fandom-y stuff today. And this wasn't my favorite, social history, Jewish American history book that I read, but, but it's definitely worth a read. And finally, in 2019, returning to the theme of when I read a John Green book, it goes to the top of the list. I read his first book, Looking for Alaska, along with about 1 million other people. And I feel like it's in the middle. Like, it's definitely not as good as The Fault in Our Stars, but I didn't find it to be as pretentious and hypocritical in a way as Paper Towns, where, he's created a Manny Pixic dream girl. I mean, in a way, Alaska kind of is that, but I found her storyline to be more believable, and some of the themes in the second half of the book, and particularly to be much more genuine and moving, so I'm cool with that. And my least read book with 80 other people was a novella, All Friends Are Necessary, which was put out by a local small press, and I wanted to support small presses and novellas because I'm writing a literary fiction novella. I read 3 novellas that came out at the same time from this publisher, and I think this one was my least favorite. I think it didn't do a lot of favors for people who didn't know the lingo of what the story was about. It was about sort of this bohemian guy in LA and listening to punk rock and doing like sort of radical art and politics with his friends. It was an interesting read, but I just don't think it's as accessible as maybe it could have been. But I am very glad, again, to try new things from smaller presses and at least give them a try. So you gotta challenge yourself sometimes, right? To see what's out there that isn't being published by the big presses. So that about covers it for me now. I will leave links to all of the reviews of the books I talked about here down below. And I should be back tomorrow to discuss the National Jewish Book Award winners, which I believe will be announced by then, because I'm going to be creating a short little reading list for myself out of them. So pretty excited. Hope some good stuff gets on the lists. So stay tuned, and thanks so much for watching, everyone. I'll see you next time.